I was asked to speak to a local school about Ash Wednesday. There was sort of a local prep school.
Tell us about death, Dave.
I thought that they were asking me to speak to the middle school. And so I prepped something short, it's going to be a morning assembly type thing. And then at 10:30 the night before, when I was looking to sort of see where I should park, I realized I was being asked to speak to the lower school, which is kindergarten through 5th grade. And they specifically wanted me to talk about Ash Wednesday and what goes on. And so it also happened to be Dr. Seuss's birthday and the beginning of like National Reading Week. So everyone was dressed up in their favorite costumes. So the librarian was Amelia Bedelia, and there's like everyone is like Hermione, and I got up there and I just told all these kids they were going to die. Like that was what I did. I didn't say it quite like that. I was like, well, kids, it's a happy day here. It's kind of a sad day over at my church. And it's because no one really gets to live forever. At least we'll get
Nobody gets out of here alive.
We go to be with God, and all of us are going to die, and it's true of you, and it's true of me, and that's why we put ashes on our forehead. And
how did that go over?
Well, you know what? The truth is, and I'm sure Sarah would back me up on this, the adults all looked uneasy. The kids looked totally interested and laughing. And we're like, we're all going to... All of our favorite movies are about everyone dying, like Disney movies.
Yes.
Yeah. The adults are like,
and
what is he
back
doing?
To life.
I was like, what I said is, I realized in that moment, there's just no child-friendly version of Ash Wednesday. It's about death.
Well, and like... I know when we lost mom and dad, I remember Neil's 4th grade teacher, who was just the best, saying it's crazy how many kids have lost grandparents this year because of COVID. So it's not like none of them have experienced death.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
They need to talk. They need to hear it acknowledged, just like all of us
people
do.
Don't acknowledge it, religious or not at all. So, that's the funny thing is we always think the kids are the ones that are going to struggle with it. It's the adults.
Yeah, the kids got up and like, hey, let's go to class now, and the adults were all like, what just happened? Is that okay? I was like, well, I'm sorry. That's what you. I tried to do it in a sweet, winsome way, but, and I probably might not have said yes if I'd realized I was speaking to like 7-year-olds. But
did I tell you about Marshall asking about death? Did I talk about it in the podcast already? We were driving to school one day, and he says, "Daddy, am I going to die? Someday, am I going to die?" And I said, "Yeah, you are." And he started to get a little teary, and he said, "I don't want to die." And I said, "Yeah, buddy, I know." But I said, it's going to be a long time from now. And, when you die, me and mommy and your brothers and Jesus are all going to be there waiting for you. And we're all going to live together forever. And so now he's really interested in what heaven is like. As my older children were, Jackson decided when he was young that heaven was a place where you get to drive a motorcycle, a rocket motorcycle with an unlimited supply of Coke. And I was like, yes, that is heaven. That's exactly your conception of heaven.
Coca-Cola, to be clear to the listeners.
To be clear.
Yes, Coca-Cola.
Good save.
Welcome to the Mockingcast, the podcast of Mockingbird Ministries. I'm David Zoll, your host, and in a few moments, I'll be joined by my co-hosts, Sarah Condon and RJ Heyman. We come to you every other week to discuss a few of the places where we currently see grace and its absence playing out in unexpected and compelling ways. We're glad to have you with us.
Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. God.
Well, first we have to just surface the fact that the time at RJ's church in West Palm Beach, Florida, was really just a dream. I want to say thank you to you and to all of our listeners. I mean, we met a bunch of Mockingcast people. There was a professor from Cornell, Vince, if you're listening. It was so nice to meet you, who dropped by and brought us maple syrup. And then
I want to say to Vince's wife, who is home with their 3 children under the age of 5, thank you for letting Vince come to West
more importantly.
Palm Beach while you were stuck in Ithaca in the dead of winter. Oh my God.
But
God
then just
bless you.
person after person at RJ's church who appreciate not only this human that I appreciate, but also that you're hearing being kind of set free and really impassioned by the gospel in a way that just you could just see it in people's eyes. They're thrilled to be at church, like so excited. And so all this stuff that RJ's been saying about these Bible studies he likes to lead, and that
turns out I might not have been lying.
He's not lying. And I want to say I thank you for having me, RJ. It was so
Thank you
Sarah,
for coming. It was so fun. Everyone's like, we gotta have him
missed.
back next year. Got to have him back next year. Well, are you going to be promoting a book next year, Dave? I'm wondering. Do you have anything coming out?
This week, the cover art for Low Anthropology was revealed. It was a huge deal. Just
It's a
reverberations
beautiful
around the
cover.
world.
It went viral. It did.
It went viral in our hearts.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, I just want RJ. I'm just so grateful that you are where you are, and to see, your ministry just thriving like that. I told Sarah, and I was sending her pictures the whole time, and she was like, "You're gonna make me cry," but it was really special. It's really something else. So I wanted to acknowledge that in front of our listeners.
Thank you for
Yeah.
coming. It was just wonderful. Yeah.
And I hope this same. I mean, I'm very excited. We're going to be in New York in about 6 weeks. So Sarah and I will be.
Oh my gosh! Wow.
First time Sarah's really spoken in this kind of way since.
Wow.
Since we lost mom and dad. Yeah.
And lots of people are signing up for that. It should be a wonderful time. That we don't actually have all the capacity in the world. So if people want to come, they should make sure to sign up sooner rather than later, just because there's still some lingering restrictions. Sarah, I did see that you went to go see Maren Morris play.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
At the Houston Rodeo, as my father would pronounce it. Yeah. So it's a weird thing. So my mom really liked pop country, women especially. And after they died, my daughter and I started listening to Maren Morris, which if you don't know Maren Morris, you probably know. She sings a song called Meet Me in the Middle that's more pop than country. But she has an incredible songbook. She's an amazing writer. And I had kind of told myself like a year ago, I was like, I had even looked at her concert schedule, like if there's a way for us to see Maren Morris, then I want to go. And then like she showed up at the rodeo, and friends, sweet friends who, it's weird in Houston, like there's like 36,000 people that volunteer for the rodeo.
What?
And if you're one of those people, you get a lot of tickets. And so they gave us tickets and we got to see her. And it was like a religious experience. I mean, truly, like she sings a song called My Church where she talks about basically her church is like road trips with like country music playing. She has like a great line like about Johnny Cash leading the church choir. It's so good. And
Johnny
I don't
Cash
know.
and Kanye.
Yeah. Kanye's not anywhere near her church.
You took pictures though of your kids like with these looks of joy and
Oh,
like
because they'd never been to a
astonishment.
concert. Like they didn't understand like that lighting was gonna change, and it was like stuff like that. They were just like, oh, it was just like so sweet. Yeah, so it was a really, I don't know. I feel like we're at this point where the kids are finally old enough that we can like take them to stuff like that, and
great.
it's so fun, So
Wow,
Yeah.
I was so happy for you.
thank you. It was a soul lift for sure.
Rutger,
Good stuff.
any what do you have to say for yourself other than the lovely community that somehow is developing
Honestly,
around you?
it's just been an overwhelming 2 weeks. This past Sunday, everything's been backed up for 2 years. And so we welcomed like 80 new members to our church on Sunday. We gave First Communion to 10 kids. We had like 400 people in worship.
That's so amazing.
Had an amazing Lent. I talked about Spider-Man 2 last night. A bunch of people came out for that. But yeah, things are good.
let's jump into these articles. The first one is about forgetfulness. Someone sent this to me yesterday. I thought it was very interesting. In the New York Times, Scott Small, who's an Alzheimer's researcher, wrote a column said, "We will forget much of the pandemic. That's a good thing." He said, "It is inevitable that over time, many of our memories of these difficult years will fade. As a neuroscientist who studies memory and memory disorders like Alzheimer's, I find this fact perhaps counterintuitively comforting. I've come to understand through new research that there is a danger in remembering too much, and that forgetting is not only normal, but in fact necessary for our mental health. It used to be thought that forgetting anything was caused to varying degrees by a failure of the brain's memory mechanisms. But new developments over the past decade refute this simple idea. Neurons contain what are sometimes called nanomachines that are dedicated to construction of new memories. But scientists have recently discovered that neurons are also endowed with a completely different set of nanomachines designed for the opposite purpose, to carefully disassemble and thus forget components of our stored memories. Normal functioning memory and forgetting work in unison. Of course, there are unhealthy kinds of forgetting. Alzheimer's disease, for one, targets memory mechanisms and causes them to fail. But in other disorders, it appears that the brain's forgetting mechanisms break down. The psychological condition that perhaps best exemplifies what can happen when people don't forget properly is PTSD. While it is often beneficial to remember the facts of a traumatic experience, sometimes in pointillist detail, it is equally important to the healing process to let the emotional valence of it fade. If we don't, we can get stuck in total emotional recall, reviving our distress in perpetuity. Forgetting protects us from this debilitating anxiety, not by deleting memories, but by quieting their emotional scream. The same is true for more run-of-the-mill emotions. Intuitively, it makes sense that we sometimes need to, quote, let go of hurt and resentment to preserve close friendships, and that we need to forget in order to forgive. Of course, we won't and shouldn't forget the pandemic. In addition to memorializing the loss of our loved ones, we should commemorate the selfless commitment of our fellow healthcare workers and rewrite our government and medical manuals so that we are able to respond better and faster next time. But for many of us, some degree of emotional forgetting will be a natural part of living in and moving forward from the pandemic. Forgetting some of the fear with which we've lived will allow us to more clearly recall the details we want to remember.
Oh, I find this incredibly reassuring.
Tell me more.
Well, it's funny. I'm thinking about my mom's brother visited with his wife a few weeks ago. And we were just kind of talking like, what's the stuff that I have, that belong to the family, and he was really surprised. I still have the gun my grandfather used to kill himself, and he got very concerned. He said, there's a note, that he left, and it's got his blood on it, and I know your mama found it, and I know it's in something, and super, fatherly concerned in a way that I'm so lucky to have in my life. And he's like, and I want you to throw that away. And I think, because I come from people who had memory was so important, right? Because they'd had so much loss. That's a constant question for me. And early on, it was like an overwhelming, I was drowning question about what memories are mine, what memories are theirs, what physical things embody those, what do I have to hold on to, how does that get passed down to kids? And I've been able to let a lot of that go. And that was like such a freedom thing for him to say to me, like, oh my gosh. And it also is memory is a weird thing for me, where memory in my family, there's a high ethic of like, is also honoring. Right.
Right.
And so that's big. And so if we are to forget, is that in some way like dishonoring? And I've had to kind of let go of some of that virtue just for the sake of sanity. And it's so reassuring to hear this, Dave. Seriously, like I feel so much better, because it's like, me softening the memories around things and maybe only choosing to remember some things enough to tell them to the children and to tell them even to myself is like actually my brain's survival mechanism.
Yeah.
And it's not me like trespassing. I don't know,
it's not necessarily you suppressing.
Yeah.
It could be
Yes,
part of
totally.
healing. I mean, we do talk about God remembering our sins no more, and there's a memory
Yeah.
aspect to it,
Dave.
that's involved with. That's in forgiveness is there is it's like forgive and forget. Well, how can you forgive if you don't forget, or how can you forget if you don't forgive? I wonder if there's just not as enormous of a distinction between those two things as we would like to think. I always find this. I mean, I remember Tully and Chivijan always said that the sins that you can't forget, God cannot remember, or something like that. And I thought that's a comforting word, especially when we do forget sometimes things that we wish we'd remembered, and we remember things we wish we didn't. But RJ, what do you think about it?
It reminded me of a podcast I heard a while ago. I can't remember if it was This American Life or Radio Lab or what it was, but it was talking to someone who, there are people who remember everything. Like there's a certain condition where you say to them, tell me about January 12th, 1994.
Oh, yeah, yes.
And they'll be like, this is what the weather was like. This was the song playing on the radio. This is what I was wearing. Like crazy detail. And that seems like a superpower. But this podcast was talking about how actually it's an incredible burden, because those people, as we all have lost people they loved. And they will, it's like being there. It's like they can never forget the pain and the grief of losing someone they love, because they remember everything. And it's so immediate that it's like the emotion is just still right there, and they wish that they could sort of forget how that felt and move on with their life. So that was really affecting. It also made me think of people that I've known in my ministry who lost a spouse, and they'll talk about their spouse in almost hallowed terms about just how amazing and wonderful and kind of perfect their husband or their wife was. And sometimes that's true, and sometimes it's really not true. Sometimes their spouse actually wasn't a very nice person.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes I'm tempted to feel a little sorry for them, or feel like that's sort of denial or something. But then I'm like, no, that's really beautiful, because the truth of our relationship with people is that it's always a mixed bag, right? It's always some good and some bad. But how we remember, the memories we hold on to around a certain person probably has more to do with how we feel about that person than what actually happened, right? So if we really loved someone, we're going to remember the good things, but if we were really hurt by them, then we're probably only going to remember the bad things, and maybe it's, that you're starting to get some healing in a relationship you have with someone in your past, when you can start to remember more of the good things and less of the bad things. And the final thought I had was, I think it's C.S. Lewis in The Great Divorce.
By the way, I think that applies to church too.
Yes.
Sorry, I think sometimes when I hear people talk about their painful church experiences, they leave out, because especially since ones that I was present for, they leave out the smiles on their faces,
all the good stuff,
and
That's
they
right.
remember acutely the pain.
Yes,
and this doesn't mean one's not less real, but
but I still want to say it's real. Probably there was some pain that they suffered that was so deep that they couldn't see the good stuff.
Yeah.
And we know we all have people like that in our life, right? Who have really wounded us. And so, we can't, we don't remember that our dad actually did coach our soccer team when we were 5 years old. All
Right.
we remember is the hurtful things he said to us when we were 13.
Yeah.
You see pictures again, and you're like, oh, maybe my dad did love me.
Yeah.
Even though I didn't feel like he did.
Yeah.
And so I think we all do that, and I have great sympathy for that. But C.S. Lewis, I think it's in The Great Divorce, says that and this is, who knows if this is true, but it's a beautiful idea. When we get to heaven, not only will our present be changed and our future be changed, but our past will be changed as well. And I've used this image before. It'll be like a needlepoint, where we could only see the bottom of the needlepoint, where it was just a mess of tangled threads and confusing, and we had no idea, and suddenly be flipped over, and we can see the beautiful picture that God has woven and made of all the various loose ends of our life, and our past will be redeemed as well. And that's a beautiful picture, and I find that, I hope that's true. right? That we'll look back and the pain of our life will be washed away, and we'll only have good memories of our earthly life. Imagine that. Or we'll see how God, was faithful through it all. So it's, I don't know, a very interesting thing to mull in my own personal life.
I keep thinking about it, and I'm doing this talk. We should put up a link to it, I guess, or these series of talks for Tablet Magazine.
The Tent.
The Tent, which is like this interfaith group of clergy, and we're all doing talks, and it's really interesting. But I'm actually doing one with a rabbi about sort of mourning and grief practices. And one of my points is like, we just actually don't have any in our like waspy world at all. Our grief practices.
Drink.
Yeah, RJ, yes, that's exactly.
We
like,
just drink.
You show up with vodka. That's our, that's the extent of it. And how there are so many just beautiful grief practices in Judaism. But one thing I think of is like, when you refer to someone who's died in Judaism, you say, may their memory be a blessing.
Ooh.
And I think that's
prayer.
Gosh, I mean, it's just so good. Like, may their memory be a blessing, The other thing, I mean, I'm always giving like grief book shout outs, but I do get, people will write to me emails and be like, I got that book and it's great. I'm reading The Grieving Brain right now, and I can't recommend it enough. So
The Grieving Brain.
The Grieving Brain. So if any of this is resonating with you, The Grieving Brain is new and it's really wonderful. So
wow. Well, gosh. Well, we're gonna shift gears and talk about RJ. You said being able to remember everything, it can be a superpower. Let's talk about
that you don't want.
That you don't want.
That you don't want. That is hell.
Let's talk about a lack of superpowers.
That's an interesting thing.
I went and saw the new Batman movie last night.
No spoilers, please.
No spoilers. Now,
who's Batman now?
Robert Pattinson from the Twilight movies.
Oh my God!
I didn't even know that.
It's definitely an emo Batman. It's as someone described it, wonderfully grim. I mean, it's a grim 3 hours, but it is
more than the Christopher Nolan.
That is a young
ones.
woman's Batman. I have to say, it's an almost 40-year-old. That is a young woman's Batman.
It's a young man. Yeah. Well, it's excellent. Or I thought I just want to say I think it was great. And one of the reasons it's so great is what was written about it. That Blake Nail wrote for Mockingbird about it, and seeing the larger themes. He wrote about something called "The Batman Satisfied Vengeance and a Symbol of Hope." And bear with me. Think about this. Superman, an S on the chest and a flapping red cape doesn't strike fear in those below the flying superhero. A teenage boy swinging in between New York taxis and skyscrapers, aka Spider-Man, isn't something the average person runs and hides away from. When the Avengers arrive on the scene, there's a sense of relief from the people. Not, of course, for the city's infrastructure or future rebuilding efforts, but for the overall safety of the inhabitants. But what happens when a glowing circle encompassing an image of a black bat appears in a dark, gloomy sky? Well, in the new Batman, directed by Matt Reeves, we see this light in the midnight Gotham sky, and it represents something closer to villainy. It strikes fear in the hearts of those in Gotham, which is DC's own Sodom and Gomorrah, debatably worthy of destruction by fire from heaven above. Vengeance is coming, and he knows all your sins. In fact, in this, it's not a big spoiler, but Batman is not called Batman. He's called Vengeance for the first half of this movie. Then Blake sort of zooms out. He says, it's a common human instinct to think fear is the way to get what you want. Whether it be your children you're attempting to get to behave, a spouse you want to listen to you, or a workplace in need of higher productivity, we utilize fear by enacting punishment in the hopes it will produce change. But in the end, it often enhances the issue. And even if results are presented, they are tainted by a lack of genuine desire, done out of sheer will not to be punished. This, of course, is not change, but rather behavior modification. Unfortunately, the bat symbol in the sky has the same effect that the church does for lots of people.
Oof.
For some who operate under the criminal element, aka self-deemed sinners, they drive by the church, and see that cross, they express a look of fear and disdain. It represents an accusatory finger from the heavens, threatening them with vengeance in the form of fire and brimstone for their wicked deeds, or simply judgment. For those who don't view themselves in such a sinful light, the church can be a symbol that God will get those other people one day with his vengeance. Pattinson's version of a Batman has struck so much fear in Gotham that even those saved by him are frightened of him, which isn't too far off from those sitting in the pews sometimes. How many Christians find themselves loved by God and simultaneously under the oppressive eye of judgment? Fearful to make the wrong move, think the wrong thought, miss a Bible study, be distracted in their prayers. It becomes a relationship with a captor, not a savior. Anyway, by the end of the film, this young Batman realizes the city doesn't need vengeance and fear. Fear has only created more problems and further driven the city into its demise. It's created worse villains and inspired others to inflict the same fear on others. Instead, the disturbed city of Gotham needs hope. Fear doesn't create change, it paralyzes. It makes people move out of necessity and desire for safety, willing to do anything if they can only feel safe for a night. But with hope, you have freedom to roam, pep in your step, something or someone who pulls you out of paralysis and tells you to be free once again. Okay, so you haven't seen the movie, I imagine, but this dynamic of fear. One of the reasons the Batman mythos is so evergreen, why it continues to. There's a lot of reasons, but one of them is that there's something about the fear will vengeance to take revenge on take it justice into your own hands to change the world by sheer force of will. I think it's a very tempting fantasy. This is a movie that takes that seriously as to the fallout that occurs when the whole city is ruled by fear. And I mean, we're living in a time right now. I mean, since we've been last recorded, there's a terrible war going on in the Ukraine, and there are people who are living in this actual kind of fear. I mean, to me, some of those images were flashing into my mind during this film, because to live under that kind of fear ultimately creates more of the same thing. It creates more fear. I don't see how the desire to strike back and to recompense it just drives the train further and further. Anyway, what this movie captures in a moment is that, and he keeps saying it. The Batman keeps saying it's like, don't use the same tools that they're using to defeat the villains, even though he realizes that just because he's not killing them doesn't mean he's not still using fear to control other people. Anyway, fear, hope, to behavior modification, Batman, any thoughts?
It made me think there are people who are still very scared of God, and need a word of love and grace, compassion, mercy. So it's a real thing. And I've been there in my life before. I'm glad not to be there anymore in that kind of really just visceral way. I mean, of course, I still feel like I oftentimes have to be something and have to earn God's favor and blessing, even though I know that that's not the gospel. I think we all struggle with that to some degree or another. But there are those in our midst who just feel like God doesn't like us.
And it's funny. That also applies to people who don't believe in God. It's there's still the emotional response can still be there. You can still run not wanting to go anywhere near a church for even if you say I don't believe in God, but I still hate him. It's
I just have yet to meet anyone who actually doesn't believe in God. I don't know.
That was my wife. That was Jamie when I first met her. She'd been through some things in her family, and she's like, I'm pretty sure I don't believe in God, but if I do, he's a real jerk, and I'll have nothing to do with him at all.
Yeah.
Which, fair enough. And let it be said, God does take responsibility for his broken world in his broken body.
Yeah.
He does not absolve himself of responsibility for the suffering and pain of the world.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, for me, this strikes the chord, and I've talked about it on here before, but of just, people wanting to get parishioners back after the pandemic and using this kind of fear mechanism, of like, I'm sure some people are saying some horrible things about God to try to get people back in church, but it's mostly just like, if you want the church to be here, you have to come and that kind of stuff. And it's just like, I always think fear works once. And then it doesn't work anymore. I don't know. I mean, unless you have a lot of power. So unless you've got a 4-year-old, that you're in charge of, then fear can work multiple times. But then when it stops working, boy, does it stop working, So it's RJ, I just love that story about the parishioner because, in the previous segment when we were talking about forgetting, and Dave, you quoted, the thing of in scripture about God forgetting our sins. And I was like part of me just in that moment was like, oh yeah. There's part of me that even when I read that in the Bible, and especially if someone says it to me, I'm like, yeah, but God's totally got a fanny pack with a list he keeps. You know what I mean? That he pulls out. He's like, I may have forgotten, but this fanny pack hadn't, sis, and so, I mean, I think, we all live in this. And part of that, just to name sort of classic kind of Mockingbird stuff that people either love or hate about us, part of that is the law and the gospel, right? Part of that is we live under the weight of the law, and the law has been completed in Jesus Christ. And so we do live in this tension, frankly. And yet, right, that's why we say the same things over and over again and find so much relief in them. The one thing that relieves the tension, that helps us to step outside of it is the gospel of grace. So, I think there's some truth in it. I don't know. I think be afraid of God, but I think when people are trying to make you afraid, no. I have to say the other thing that keeps playing in my brain is that we are often, when we're met with the fear of people, when people are making us afraid, it's always remarkable to me when people choose to not react with violence, not meet them with violence. And I keep thinking about the nuclear power plant and the missile attacks from the Russians, and how I couldn't quite understand what was happening, but it was the people who were in control of the power plant, the Ukrainians, kept begging them over the speakers, because the Russians were inside. I think the Ukrainians maybe had control outside, but kept begging them verbally to stop, hurting the power plant, because it was going to hurt everyone. And I have to say, as much as we've, it's hard to watch the news, and as much violence, reciprocal violence as there has been, totally understandably, what I find so moving is when, these Ukrainians just say, we don't understand. What is, there's almost a peaceful, negotiation, or I hesitate to say turning of the other cheek, but it's something that feels very, I don't know if it feels Christian, I don't know, but it's very moving to me, where it's we don't understand,
Well, what we understand instinctually is Batman's tactics. I don't think we understand the hope. Though there's a moment in this movie when the switch turns for him, and then all of a sudden,
Don't blow it.
All of a sudden he becomes a light, and he's carrying a flare and leading people out of a flooded situation, and it's a completely different MO, and you feel, even though the movie doesn't really get much lighter, you think hope has actually entered the picture, and the fear, because fear does beget more fear. This is
for sure
totally true. And one of the things that this reminded me of, the movie, was something that this past week. I don't really watch Bill Maher. I kind of can't stand the guy, but
why? He's so entertaining and funny, Dave.
There was a young woman, a young black scholar named Chloe Valdari, who was on there, and she was featured in the Atlantic last year as sort of she's become a diversity, equity, and inclusion expert who training people, doing classes that actually people don't hate. and the Atlantic highlighted her last year because she's got something what she calls the theory of enchantment, and she works with Daryl Davis some, RJ, and Sarah, who you know. Connor Friedersdorf, who wrote this article, said the theory of enchantment elicits unusual openness, trust, and engagement from ideologically diverse observers, including many critics of more conventional DEI training approaches. And I'll say this. After graduating in 2015, Valerie reflected that although her academic field offered many frameworks for combating conflict, it seldom addressed a related but conceptually distinct task, teaching people how to love. Wasn't that a glaring deficiency? One of her heroes, Martin Luther King, repeatedly stated in the last decade of his life that the end goal of his activism, even beyond equal rights for all people, was the creation of a beloved community rooted in redemptive agape love. It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opponents into friends, King said. It is this type of understanding goodwill that will transform the deep gloom of the old age into the exuberant gladness of the new age. Valerie decided she wanted to teach people to love like that. But how? Well, she would study what people already love in hopes of reverse engineering the process. The theory of enchantment eschews newly ascendant social justice concepts and academic literature in favor of philosophical texts, civil rights movement speeches, authors such as James Baldwin, and pop culture, including shoe commercials, scenes from films, and song lyrics. First, she focuses on people's relationship with themselves. A person cannot love another human being or treat another human being with dignity if they do not love themselves, she argued on Twitter in October, noting that Baldwin agreed. White people in this country will have quite enough to do in learning how to accept and love themselves and each other. And when they have achieved this, the Negro problem will no longer exist, for it will no longer be needed. Valerie believes that the same logic applies to people of all races, and she never segregates her students because, quote, we all deal with insecurities. When humans handle insecurity poorly, she says, it fuels self-contempt, and overcompensation for self-contempt fuels extremist ideologies, including racism. She aims to teach the skills to develop self-worth, urging reflection on challenges we all share: mortality, imperfection, vulnerability, parental baggage. By making peace with the most trying aspects of the human condition, she says, you will be able to develop a capacity for empathy. You will naturally want to create inclusive spaces because the lens through which you see the world will be driven by openness, not by fear or cynicism. She says this, once you understand that there's a whole lot of baggage and complexity behind the facades we project, you start to look for the depth of things, gain awareness of your own depth, and see the depth in others. We teach about Daryl Davis, the black musician who successfully convinced multiple people to leave the KKK. We teach something from a show called The Redemption Project, where Van Jones went to San Quentin to arrange conversations between victims and offenders. It has nothing to do with race. The individuals are of the same racial background, but it's a powerful example of redemption, where people dig deep within their hearts to forgive people who have wronged them on an existential level. That was a touchy territory, but I thought one of some of her themes of wanting to...
I'm excited about this territory, David Zoll. I don't know what you're talking about.
I think, yeah.
This is basically what we do.
I try to. I just low anthropology.
I was like, are we enchanting people? This is so interesting.
It's just church.
Yeah.
This is what we do at church. We preach the gospel.
I
And
mean,
people get
it's very
forgiven, and
Mockingbird.
maybe they can actually forgive somebody else, and maybe
It's and dealing with the personal, right? I mean, this is the thing that, like,
the universal.
This is the crisis of mainline Protestantism.
Yes,
is that we skip the personal.
Yeah.
Yes.
We skip it. It's too much trouble. We don't want to talk about personal sin. We don't want to make people feel bad about themselves. Only in avoiding making people feel bad about themselves, we make them feel really bad about themselves, because then we just talk about the communal all the time and everything that the community, right, is getting wrong.
And people just get angry and balkanized.
Yeah,
and do nothing.
it's just like, we have to have this woman speak for us.
I actually tried. She's too expensive right now, but hopefully if we get maybe someone will listen, maybe someone knows her.
Hopefully she'll get less popular.
Yeah,
and then we can afford her.
Well, it's.
I don't think that's gonna happen.
No, it's not.
But I mean, that's just it's. I mean, I love the Daryl Davis crossover that we have had Mr. Davis speak for us. Like, it's just incredible. I think it's so true. Like, until we deal with the personal. Like, it reminds me of an article about, I read once about like empathy in children, because, like it was such a big deal. Like, how do we make children more empathetic? How do we make children, here's a book about empathy here, which is sort of like, here's a book about racism, and the way that we make children more empathetic is that we remind them of times when people took care of us when we were in need. That's literally the only way to build empathy. It's not like we do this because we're good people. It's, hey, remember when you lost your house in Harvey and people showed up with bedding and a home for you and toys? Remember that? So it's just this, it's so fascinating. And I wonder if part of the reason we're so bad at starting with the personal from any ideology is because we're just in such groupthink now, of like, I wear a mask because, I'm a Democrat and because I care about people. And it's so much easier to attach ourselves to these like lists as opposed to like opening up our hearts. It's just so much easier, and it's so much more destructive.
I mean, she thinks that people basically get resentful when they're put into huge groups, because she says as a black person, she gets resentful of constantly being told she can do this and not that. And
of course.
And then she also gives the example of Jay-Z realizing going into therapy and that opening him up to the rest of the world and wanting to like do good in the world.
Yeah.
I'm convinced. I think a lot of racism, I mean, yes, there's a lot of ignorance, but I think a lot of it is contempt and a way to deal with the world by blaming or scapegoating other people. And you feel better about yourself if you can dump on someone else, a whole group. You can reduce the world down to these things. And maybe it's naive, but she thinks that love is the answer, and love only flows from people who feel loved and not somehow accused all the time. And so
reconciliation only flows from people who've been reconciled to God. Acceptance only flows from those who've been accepted.
It's an enormous burden for her to take on, by the way, to have to educate other people about this, especially.
And can you imagine the feedback this person gets? Like, I'm just like, oh my gosh.
But she says that like they've been hired by TikTok and WeWork and like because I think the secret that no one wants to admit is
the two most reputable companies.
Well, a lot of
in America.
I'm talking about the mainstream.
Mockingbird's trying to hire. We just don't have enough money.
Exactly.
But
we'll give her a write-off.
It's commonly acknowledged that a lot of these diversity, inclusion, equity training sessions can become just
they make people very angry.
People just
they don't work.
They have to tolerate them. They're like, I'll get through this. I'll tune out. And they don't want to admit, but they don't learn anything. It only makes them never want to do another one again. And she was like, well, what if we did one that sort of focused on love? And love is, people's like, that's a luxury, that's a way to enable things. But she says like she says that the greatest gift of the black community has been to nonviolent turning the other cheek type of Christian witness in the world.
Absolutely.
And she does.
Yeah.
She is a
100%.
Christian, but she also, I think, is sort of de-emphasizes that stuff.
We just outed her.
I'm sorry.
She's a Christian. No, it's
Well,
fine.
it's interesting stuff. I got to listen to more, and I think it was a confounding for Bill Maher a little bit.
I mean, aren't most things that have anything to do with mercy and grace and love confounding for? I mean, God bless Bill.
Well, the next piece is built on this tremendously, and it's one of the best things I've read in a while. It's a newsletter from Richard Beck. Richard Beck, who's a theologian on the West Coast. It's called Stop Sneering and Get to Work. Sarah, I almost felt like you could have written this. He says, we have a void in our culture. Actually, we don't have a culture, is to put it a different way. Where there should exist a shared vision of the good, we have an emptiness, a nothing, a nullity. We possess technology, but no shared vision of the future, of the true, the beautiful, and the good. And this, argued missiologist Leslie Newbegin, makes us a very strange tribe. This is what would strike the Martian anthropologists. If Martians came and saw us, what they would... If Martians visited the Earth, what would strike them most forcefully is here is a culture where no one agrees because goodness does not exist. If you understand the culture of the modern world, then, you'll immediately understand why topical preaching and ideologues have a broad appeal. Their advice giving is inserting values into the void. Any pastor with a good missionary mind should be able to see that dynamic. And he talks about taking his students from Fuller University to go to tour Homeboy Industries, which is, Greg Boyle's thing in Los Angeles. And this guy, this sort of former gang member, just talks about, he doesn't know anything about their churches, but he's like, who's my guy? It's Joel Osteen. I love that guy.
Yeah.
And everyone agrees that like this guy would never be in one of their churches, but for some reason Joel Osteen is able to talk to him. And then Beck goes on to say, anyone who's paid 2 seconds of attention to the modern world knows exactly why Osteen has such wide appeal. Rob Bell got it exactly right. He observed that Osteen was parenting people who have never had any parenting, at least not any good parenting. Many people have never experienced a stable family where they heard constant and unconditional messages of positivity, praise, and encouragement. Most people never grew up hearing, you can do this, you got this, I believe in you. But you know who says that over and over? Do you know who believes in you? Joel Osteen believes in you. And then he goes on to take the same approach to worship music, Christian contemporary music. He says, I can't tell you how many times I've heard seminary-educated pastors and seminary professors sneer at Christian praise music. The music is castigated for being overly individualistic, therapeutic, and sentimental.
It's too personal.
We sneer and call it Jesus is my boyfriend music. You'll see the point if you listen to the lyrics of a song like Hillsong's Oceans, which has over 120 million YouTube views, or Lauren Daigle's You Say, over 242 million YouTube views. Lyrics like You Are Mine and I Am Yours, In You I Find My Worth, and In You I Find My Identity. But instead of sneering at the therapeutic individualism of these songs, their focus upon me and my feelings, take a second to listen to these songs as a missionary, as a cultural anthropologist. Instead of LOL, 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 how about we think for a second? To what deep ache in the modern world are these songs appealing to? This isn't rocket science. The reason praise songs centering therapeutic themes of God's intimate care and love are so popular are simple. Anxiety, depression, suicide, loneliness, and addiction are all skyrocketing. So the appeal of songs like Oceans or You Say or No Mystery, these songs are hitting us right where we are hurting. Their appeal is blindingly obvious to any decent missionary. What he's saying is that in a seminary-educated Christian context, it's so easy to look down on people who are giving overly personal, what you consider to be too personal or irrelevant messages. And yet the proof is kind of in the pudding. We're only reaching other people who think those same critiques are true, but the rest of the world is just sitting there hurting, dying to be addressed personally in their loneliness, their anxiety, before they can go out and think about the world or correctly worship,
Right.
Worship
Right.
with their God-centered piety. I mean,
Right.
I understand it doesn't wash away all the critiques of these things, and some of these things are really overt, like the Jesus is my boyfriend stuff, to the point of discomfort. But
unless you're in a lot of pain.
Yeah. I mean, don't you think
Unless
so?
you're in a lot of pain. And then you hear it and you're like, I feel so seen and loved. I'm going to cry now, And then you feel catharsis and then you feel
do.
better.
You walk out feeling a lot better.
I sometimes am struck in my own denomination and our denomination by how much people are like, traditional prayers in the Book of Common Prayer and traditional music and the hymns. And it's like, whose tradition? Whose tradition? White people from England? Is that okay? Like that is a stream of tradition, Yeah, and I love the old hymns. I mean, I am a college minister and my students love the old hymns. Like that's what we sing every week, But there's also a ministry group on campus that does more of the sort of, I feel like any contemporary Christian music, right? And there are students that love that and go there, and that's a beautiful thing for them. So I don't know. It always feels like an interesting conversation of privilege. And I don't know. I don't know how to say this carefully, so I won't. But I think like 95% of the things that you hear in seminaries are wrong. And I think that seminary is nothing. Saying seminary is like parish ministry is like saying like gardening is like having a baby. Okay? It's not the same thing at all, right? If you use the same practices to grow carrots as you do for a colicky newborn, the baby's not going to make it, you know? Like, and that is like, it's just the worst. I just feel like so much of the information people get and sort of these biases that we try to grow in clergy and young, impressionable clergy around, you know, contemporary Christian music and how we're so much better than, you know, these people who just like pray extemporaneously, or we're so much better than Joel or whatever. I mean, you know, Joel's church is full of immigrants, right? Like I mean, honestly, like Joel Osteen's church is full of immigrants. Like it's full of people who like are looking for a comforting word, who are looking for, you know, positivity. And I will be honest with you, I really recoil at the idea of positivity in church.
Well, what they're saying is, I don't think it's positivity. What I think is what we're saying is that if you were, frankly, from my background, which is educated, privileged, you know, neurotic white guy, when I walk into, and when people like me walk into when they hear a Joel Osteen sermon, what they often hear is, if you believe harder, try harder, do better, read your Bible more, then God will not only love you, God will bless you with all sorts of things. They hear an if-then, law. Now, if you're coming from a different cultural context, and I think the proof is just simply in the pudding, there might be something we're not hearing, which is, if you've never thought that anyone cared about you, if you've never thought you were capable of anything, you might, instead of hearing a no or an if-then, you might go in there and hear, gosh, this guy seems to not only think that I'm worth speaking to, but might think that God cares about me enough to care about my actual concerns, which a lot of times are financial, because I'm totally, you know, living month to month and paycheck to paycheck. Yeah. And so where we hear the law, other people might hear the gospel. That's not to say that there's something deeply, objectively off-putting about some certain people and the capped white teeth and all that stuff. But I still think that we're getting something wrong here, and what people are finding is they're being addressed where they actually are, rather than where they think they should be. And there are some cultural differences that are not being acknowledged, and one of the great cultural differences is the fact that is sort of borne out in our understanding of sort of collective versus individual. It's so interesting. I do think it's there's a racial component to it, which is very uncomfortable for people. The people that are preaching the most about racism tend to be the ones who are making all of the distinctions there, and they're not reaching the actual
in seminary classes that are all white.
Sorry. I'm done for my soapbox.
The thing, Dave, is like, I hear what you're saying. I agree with all of it, and I don't like the way it makes me feel. You know, like, it's like, I mean, like, I've never thought about that before, and now I'm uncomfortable with all of the previous convictions I had about how much I didn't like Joel Osteen. Like,
I mean,
this isn't fun for me. RJ, what do you think?
My first thought is it makes me thankful for different denominations. You know, people are always like, they mourn like, oh, the prayer that Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, that all his believers would be one. You know, why can't we just be one? It's like, well, maybe God actually knows what he's doing. And maybe there are different denominations preaching his message in different ways because he knows that different people need to hear things differently. And to trust a little bit that, you know, I will say my general, this sounds weird to say, my general kind of faith is not the right word, but it's dawning on me that maybe church is actually the best way for people to hear about and experience Jesus, which I probably wouldn't have said 10 or 20 years ago. You know, I think I've been skeptical of the church for like a long time, and the church is broken, and the church has injured people, and there are people who have been wounded by the church, and at the same time,
wounded you.
at the same time, God seems to work through the church.
Yeah.
Writ large, right? The universal church, all the denominations, the churches. And I will say, I'm not a big Joel fan, but I remember a buddy of mine in Houston being like, that Lakewood has 50 full-time paid therapists that any one of their congregants can go see at any time free of charge. And I was like, what? I did not know that.
What?
And then when Hurricane Harvey hit, all these people from around the country were dumping on Lakewood for not opening their doors to refugees. And I was like, you guys, no one can reach it. Like, it's literally impossible to get there because it's an island in the middle of a lake.
Yeah.
And then they gave away millions and millions of dollars. So I'm conflicted. I do think about prosperity gospels, and I think about that passage in the Bible where it says, there'll come a time when people will not put up with sound doctrine, but will gather around them people who say what their itching ears want to hear. And Paul's talking about the law, right? We want to hear the law, if then. But Dave, I think what you said about just because I hear something as the law doesn't mean that someone else does.
Don't like it.
Your father talks about preaching the enabling word, and that sometimes it is a matter of pastoral sensitivity. And whatever Joel's doing, it seems to be working. You do wish he would sort of talk about Jesus a little bit more.
Oh yeah,
or something.
The point here is not to exonerate
I don't know.
Content of what's being said. I think but something can be said and can be heard a different way, and something about or to any singular prosperity thing. I'm just being struck by. Yes, there is people always flock to the law, some sort of formula that if I do this, then I'll get that. But I think that what Beck is trying to say is imagine, use some imagination.
There's something else going on. When I was in
Palm Beach 2 weeks ago, I had a number of people, and these are people, it's actually quite a diverse church, even though it's very, the zip code it's not, let's just say none of us are buying houses there anytime soon. But it's, it is I kept hearing people say to me, because I was always fishing for compliments about RJ, just to make sure they knew how special this guy is. And
I paid him extra to
what
do
I
that.
heard, what I kept hearing people say is, it's so strange. I feel like he's speaking directly to me. I feel like he's talking just to me. And I thought to myself, and then I also had, some of the people had come from another church where they just felt that they'd been grouped in with sort of the privileged and the folks that need to save the world, and that had not produced fidelity, shall we say, loyalty or devotion. What it did produce is I just stopped going because I don't want to just get lectured all the time. But then when they went and heard this silly Dutch guy speak, that he was speaking directly to, and these people were tears in their eyes. They said, I've been in church my whole life and no one's ever actually talked to me about me. And I thought to myself, this whole church as a community is growing as a collective in leaps and bounds, and there's so much energy for the community, for other people. And then the same week I watched my parents, who go to a bunch of different churches, but one of the churches they go to is a Pentecostal church, and these people who are constantly being taught about individual faith and God relating to them in this hyper individualistic way, you might say, they packed up and sent 1 million meals to the Ukraine for refugees. 1 million in a week. Let me tell you what. My Episcopal church did not do that. And it's it was not going to be publicized. We do other things and we're trying to do our best. But I thought, 1 million? Are you kidding me? These individualists, consumerist, materialistic Christians are just sitting there sending 1 million meals to people they've never met across the ocean and then bringing them. They actually went to Poland to bring them to the.
It's crazy.
I thought to myself,
the pictures your dad put up, it's just crazy.
I thought to myself, gosh, something's getting lost in translation here. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. But our traditional music is so much better.
I mean, we got these incredible hymns.
That's so crazy to me. I love telling the story about how Martin Luther would go down to the bars being what are they singing in the bars? And then would go home and write sacred lyrics to it. So it's basically imagine walking into church every week and singing a Taylor Swift song that I've just whipped up a few Jesus-y lyrics to.
I mean, that's what a lot of
that's
these
the Reformation.
Yes, I
that's
love
the
that.
Reformation.
That's so good.
It's every one of your traditional hymns at some point, somebody complained about it. Like, what is this crazy, it's 1880s
Yeah.
music? You know, like...
Well, this is Mockingbird, so we're not going to end on a note of positivity. Sarah, I'm going to let you have the final word. I'm going to read to you from your own piece from the Relief of Lent that you published on Mockingbird. And you said this. And by the way, it's positive in its ultimate sentiment, but
don't sugarcoat it.
This is what she says. Amidst my to-do list and holiday existential angst, you're talking about various seasons here. The church often spends Advent telling me I need to be more present. By the time Christmas gets here, I feel as though I've been hit in the head with a wreath. We may be singing Silent Night, but I'm often so exhausted that I'm hoping for a silent nap. Epiphany is the season when I worry about taking down holiday decorations and hoping to glimpse this elusive light everyone keeps mentioning. And aside from having the churchiest name ever, Ordinary Time, capital O, capital T, feels like your friend that needs medication for anxiety but just keeps saying she's high-strung. Get some meds, girl. Ain't nothing ordinary about right now.
Stop talking about me, Sarah.
Yeah, you're talking to RJ. Lent, however, is this big, beautiful purple ocean of sadness. The church takes us into her arms and says, "Oh, you grieve? I grieve too." It is in this season specifically that our nagging questions rise to the top. Will our regrets define the landscape of our lives? Can we possibly outrun our shame? Are we the only lonely ones in the room? Lent is the moment when we sit in the worn-down pews where generations of rear ends have rested, and we collectively ask, what will become of us? Then you shift gears a little bit. You say, nothing makes me sadder than a Lenten discipline that involves a diet. God does not want your carbohydrates or your sugar. God wants you. We are promised that God knows our weaknesses personally. Our fears about the world around us, our inability to be the kind of parent we long to be, our jealousies and our fury, the sadness of loss that refuses to let us go. How in the world could someone show up and love the worst of us? And why in the world would Jesus choose that lot for himself? And so, what does this mean for that other season in our beautifully antiquated church calendar? What does this mean for Easter? Do you have to practice a meaningful Lent in order for Easter to feel as glorious as we are promised it is? Given the last few years that humanity has suffered, the war our world is facing, and whatever weaknesses your soul personally suffers, I would ask you this. Do we even have a choice? Sarah, such a beautiful piece.
Oh, thanks. Honestly, just such a relief to write. So I'm just thankful to be able to write, because I feel like everything has been about mom and dad, and everything is sort of about mom and dad anyway, but this felt like I could write about something else, for the first time, which was
Tell us more about what inspired it.
Well, honestly, I just love that Lent is a season for the sad people. I don't know. I find a lot of comfort in that. And I used to think that Lent, and I think most people think Lent, right, is the season where we have to give something up, and it's like we have to be super penitential, and we're not, as I think it was one of the first early sort of liturgical pieces I wrote for Mockingbird, but we're not, Jesus in the desert, having a dance off with Satan. That's not, we somehow frame that as what Lent is in our brains, that we are we're out there. We're not, that's not happening, right? Jesus is doing that on our behalf. You giving up chocolate is not you, taking on the devil. And so for me, Lent has just become this place where my sadness has a place to rest. And, I think about what my friend Callie Pitcock said last year during Lent, and I've thought about it a lot this Lent. This no matter how Lent sort of goes, Easter is always one day closer to us, right? No matter what we do, Easter is ever getting closer. And so there's a lot of hopefulness to me there. But yeah, I just feel like Lent is for the sad ones, and I love that. And I don't know. I wonder if people hear that and think well, that that's negative. I don't know, because we're talking about positivity and negativity, but my life has never brought me as much joy as I have for it now. And it's taken.
I think negativity would be the injunction, don't be sad. You're not allowed to feel sad. That's the negativity, like not being acknowledged, being sort of forcibly ignored almost, or accused would be to say your sadness has no place, you know?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. But I think like I have a tremendous amount of joy in my life, but also like recognizing the sadness is, I don't know. This book, The Grieving Brain, which I'm obsessed with right now, one of the sort of reasons I bought this book is that the writer talks about how one of the reasons people can't leave their grief is because your brain literally has to rewire, right? And so there's this great experiment. You can totally cut this, Dave, but there's this great experiment I'm obsessed with a mouse and a blue Lego, and they put a mouse in one of those like scientific things, and it goes around the blue Lego, right? Well, one day they take out the blue Lego, and it's a mouse, the tiny brain, and the mouse still makes space for the blue Lego. The point being that like our grief, has to like, things have to rewire in order for it to settle. And I just think that Lent is like this wonderful place where we can face absence. And our brain can find a way to rewire through that.
Yeah.
I think everyone needs to go. I'm going to go rewatch Inside Out, which is 100% about you cannot find joy and peace if you do not create room for sadness.
Yeah.
And if you try to just shove sadness to the side, you'll just shut down.
Yeah.
You'll just completely shut down, right?
Yeah.
You have to create space for the negativity and the mourning to come out so that it can be healed and dealt with.
We call that a Gatorade movie in our family because you're so dehydrated from crying that you need Gatorade.
That's what I told those little kids, by the way, on Ash Wednesday, to be honest with you. I said sometimes the best way to feel happy is to talk about the things that make you sad.
Dave, that's so good.
Ash Wednesday is a time.
And all the teachers freaked.
Sadness, what? Joy of the Lord. No.
They're like, who let this guidance counselor in here?
It's the Joel Osteen stat. Sorry, RJ, I cut you off, though. What else would you say?
No.
Any other Lenten thoughts? I mean, you're doing this.
Well, I just, there's one little passage of scripture that I've been thinking about all throughout, especially a little early, but I love this, and we forget this sometimes. It's from 2 Corinthians chapter 1, where Paul says, as surely as God is faithful, our word to you has not been yes and no. For the Son of God, Jesus Christ, whom we proclaimed among you, was not yes and no, but in him it is always yes. For in him every one of God's promises is a yes. And I love that we have this conflicted relationship with ourselves and with God, and sometimes we feel we feel like he is a no, and we're trying to figure it out. But just in Jesus Christ, all God's promises are yes, and because of that, we can just live in freedom and truth. We don't have to hide. We can bring what we are. We also don't. I don't know. We can rejoice if there's someone else with whom we don't agree 100%, who is making God's yes manifest to people that we're unable to do that for. I think about good old Joel. So I love that passage.
That's beautiful. RJ Heyman, ladies and gentlemen. Sarah, great to be with you. Happy Lent, I guess.
Have a good one.
I just feel like my whole life is
up.
Lent. I'll just be honest with you. Like I
put on honey. Put on some purple. Go sit in a pew and cry. Remember that God doesn't have a fanny pack with your sins in it, okay?
And go watch The Batman. That's a Lenten movie if ever there was one. Good God.
And then Inside Out.
And then really watch Inside Out, yeah. Well, the two of you, thank you so much. We'll talk to you in a couple weeks. Sign up for the New York conference, everybody. We hope to see you there. And we just thank you for listening, as always. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. Remember, you can find us on the web at www.mbird.com. And we'd always love to hear from you at info@mbird.com. Audio production for the Mockingcast is provided by TJ Hester. And if you like what you've heard, please drop over to iTunes and leave us a rating or review. Until next time.
Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord.